Is it crime fighting or a breach of privacy? Switzerland caves into US pressure and says it will repeal legislation that forbids its banks from disclosing client information. What will happen to the billions of dollars outsiders invested in Swiss banks? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. A Swiss government bill has just been put to Parliament which would allow Swiss banks to hand over internal information to the US authorities. The planned deal will now allow its banks to cooperate with US investigators to help with what they said was a prevention of continuing criminal activity. Sidestepping Switzerland's own secrecy laws, the move, previously outlawed, is meant to help resolve tax disputes. The Swiss decision has two key points. Over the course of 12 months, banks will be allowed to turn over general statistical information to American authorities. But more importantly, the US can seek concrete account details. Credit Suisse and Julius Baer are among the banks that have so far agreed to cooperate. The Swiss Finance Minister Evelyn Widmer-Schlumpf says the decision was taken to restore stability to Swiss banking. She said, "We are convinced it's a good pragmatic solution that really helps the banks resolve this issue. What we're really aiming for is that stability and calm finally returns so our banks can go after their core business, which is providing good services." Well, 4 years ago, the US brought a historic case against Swiss banking giant UBS. The bank was accused of conspiring to help 52,000 American clients evade taxes. UBS avoided prosecution, but at the cost of revealing the names of almost 5,000 US customers. They were also forced to pay a fine of $780 million. The case pierced Swiss banking secrecy for the first time and changed the way the US pursues offshore tax evaders. Well, to discuss all of this, joining us are our guests. From Geneva, we have Jean-Pierre. He's an economist and is the General Secretary of the Convention of Independent Financial Advisors. And from Washington, D.C., we have Kevin Hassett. He's the Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank. Welcome to you both. Let's begin in Geneva. Jean-Pierre Disserand. The initial reaction from banks has been generally welcoming. What is your view of this new legislation that's being introduced?
Well, the legislation, we don't know, the finer details of the legislation yet. And what we have to be aware is that basically there is an agreement somewhere, and the U.S. authorities or the IRS are requesting Switzerland to sign this agreement, and then they will work out the details later. Now, this for generally Switzerland would or should be unacceptable. To make a point, too, I'm not here to defend the interest of the banks. I'm here as a representative of the Convention of Independent Financial Advisors, and we do defend the investors' interest. Now, when we look at all this pressure from the United States on Switzerland to change its bank secrecy rules and to open its books to the IRS, immediately the question is, where is the reciprocity for this? And we have to be aware that the United States is the first competitor of Switzerland for global wealth management. This is a very important point. And when we look at the situation in which the U.S. economy is right now, of course, it is their interest to aggress their first competitors and to try to get that business back to the United States.
Well, if I may just stop you at that particular point. Sorry to interrupt, Jean-Pierre Disserand, yes. But I just wanted to put a point that you made directly to Kevin Hassett. You heard the question there. Where is the reciprocity?
The specific issue is that there were court cases in the U.S. that surprised me with their finding that if you're a Swiss bank and you allow U.S. citizens to avoid U.S. tax, then I think everybody thought, and even the Swiss banks themselves thought, that the U.S. government, the enforcement authorities, would go after the citizens themselves, and then if they could find those citizens, they would take them to tax court and even put them in jail if they're avoiding U.S. tax. But the U.S. wouldn't try to go after the banks, especially banks that don't even have operations in the U.S. I think that the real surprise is that there was one bank, I think I'm supposed to pronounce it Vagelin, that really got a massive fine and even shut down, and they did so because they were found to be abetting tax avoidance in the U.S., even though they were just operating under Swiss law. And I think that ruling and those big fines basically put a chill on Swiss banks, even to the point where if you're a U.S. citizen, I understand it's almost impossible to get a bank account if you're living in Switzerland right now because everyone's so afraid of the IRS. And I think that what's going on with this legislation is that there have been a lot of Americans that use the Swiss privacy laws to avoid U.S. tax. And by going after the banks, the IRS has more or less made that deal almost impossible. I don't think that I've not heard of anecdotally that there are a lot of Swiss citizens using U.S. banks to avoid Swiss tax. And so I think the reciprocity issue is kind of a moot point.
Well, Jean-Pierre, if you want to continue with the point that you started about the U.S. is actually a competitor in the financial wealth management business. We have a situation now where the playing fields may not be particularly level.
Well, that is perfectly correct, because if you look at what Florida is doing with South America, if Brazil is going to ask the same questions to the U.S. government that the U.S. government is asking to, for example, Switzerland, I know that already Mexico asked those questions many years ago and never got any answers. So we are right now in a situation where the U.S. government is preaching, well, do as I say, but don't do as I do. And this is a very uncomfortable situation for the investors, because investors are looking for stability and they're interested in systems that are going to be performing over the next year, where they have guarantees. And we have to say that on the international level, what is being pushed, or what is happening with FATCA for U.S. citizens, is a major concern, because just from a human rights aspect, we will see that if you implement FATCA, then the IRS has nothing to do. They do not have to chase any tax dodgers anymore. They can just sit back, and probably 75% of the personnel of the IRS can be laid off, because all reporting should be done directly and electronically, and the U.S. government will know exactly, like Big Brother, however their citizens are spending their money and what they're doing.
Well, if I can just clarify for our viewers, you mentioned the acronym FATCA, that is the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which essentially means that the U.S. must be informed of every account held overseas, offshore, by a U.S. citizen. Kevin Hassett, your view of this Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which appears even wider and larger than the pressure that's being put on Swiss banks specifically in this recent case?
It's a very ambiguous part of the law. It's something that I think is still evolving. The fact is that it's clear that the citizen of the U.S. or the citizen of any country has a responsibility to adhere to the laws of his country. And what's happened here is that the U.S. has put a responsibility in U.S. courts on Swiss banks to enforce U.S. law, which is kind of extraterritorial. It's something that historically hasn't been a pursuit of the IRS. And there is a level playing field in the sense that if I'm a U.S. investor and I invest in the U.S. or I invest in Switzerland, then I can now expect the same treatment. I think that with regard to the other kind of reciprocity, really, if you follow the logic of what the U.S. has done, it would depend on the revenue authorities, say in Brazil or Mexico, to, if they think that U.S. firms are helping citizens of Mexico or Brazil avoid the tax laws of those countries, then they would have to go over them after them in Mexican or Brazilian courts, just as the U.S. went after Swiss firms in U.S. courts. It's kind of a messy space, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of action in years to come to try to clean it up. I think that the bill that you mentioned is one effort in that regard.
Well, let's just pause here and see exactly what we're talking about. For over 300 years, Swiss banks have had a code of secrecy regarding their account holders. The code was enshrined in law in the Banking Act of 1934, when it became a criminal offence for bankers to divulge client information. There are some exceptions, though, if accounts are used for things like drug trafficking, organised crime, or insider trading. But there has to be strong evidence of a crime before a government agency, especially a foreign one, can access account information. Interestingly, tax evasion is considered a misdemeanor rather than a crime in Switzerland. But as we've heard, Switzerland is now considering plans to relax its once untouchable banking secrecy laws. And the question is, what about the clients? And I'd like to go to Jean-Pierre with that as somebody representing them. Is there going to be a movement of funds away from Swiss banks?
Well, statistics show that this has not happened. And let's go back to the origin in 1933 of the Swiss bank secrecy. Let's not forget that in 1933, Germany and Europe was going through terrible times, and we had, after the crash of 1929, all countries who were broke and running after money of their citizens, and there was kind of a witch hunt. It's very interesting to see that the situation of 1933 is very similar to the situation of 1913. And what I want to point out is that what happened in, the Germans were expropriating Jewish families and Jewish people from what they owned. And Switzerland was there and actually protected these people as much as it could from expropriation. Now, if we look at what happened in Cyprus, there happened exactly the same expropriation, or basically a same expropriation. The argument in Cyprus was to say, yes, don't worry really about these people we take the money from, because they're Russians, and the Russians, they don't really earn their money all that honestly. Doesn't that sound just like the same principles that were defended in Europe, and nobody was moving against them in 1930, when it was also specific people that were being disowned, and the political pressure was nothing. Now, we have to look at kleptocratic states who are right now just struggling because they have foolishly spent the money of the taxpayers over the last 25 years. And those countries who have not done that and who are in a better situation, of course, they will be attacked because they do have potential. And be it in that situation or be it, the competition between the wealth management at world level between the United States or Switzerland, of course, there is something to be taken and something to be gained for the United States by reducing the size of the wealth management in Switzerland to increase it in the United States. We should not underestimate the economic wars that are presently going on worldwide.
Well, Kevin Hassett, I want to pick up on one phrase there, the kleptocratic state, the increasing role played by governments in terms of seizing assets which are those of private citizens or demanding that it investigate these particular assets. What's your view of this? Is this governments trying to make good for their own inability to properly police their countries, to properly run their countries? What is the line between privacy, which every citizen should have a right to, and criminal action, or states claiming criminal action? Help guide us through this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I'm quite sympathetic to what I think that is kind of the tone of both of your guys' positions here. That I think the U.S. absolutely has the right to try to enforce its laws on its citizens. And the thing that was surprising in this case was that the IRS tried to compel banks in another country that were obeying the long-held laws of that country to help them enforce U.S. law against U.S. citizens. And that's a different game than the one that I think that the Swiss banks themselves expected that anyone would ever play. And again, it's right that if you take that completely in the extreme, then it can run out of control. Like every country on earth is requiring every business in every other country to enforce its own laws. It becomes a web that nobody can navigate. And so I think I could see that. But in the end, the fact is, and I've looked through the U.S. case in the U.S. with regard to this one firm that I mentioned, that they knew that U.S. citizens were breaking the law, that their clients were breaking the U.S. law, and they knew that their actions were helping them break the U.S. law, and they continued to do that because, I guess, as you said, that tax evasion is a misdemeanor. And they might have continued to do that because it was Swiss law that they do so. But they were very cognizant of the fact that their clients were breaking U.S. law, and it put them in a difficult situation that ended up costing them lots and lots of money in U.S. courts.
And in fact, put them out of business indeed. But we come to that question of that line between tax evasion and tax fraud. The particular case you're referring to, clearly it was decided that was a clear case of tax fraud, knowingly contravening the law, albeit of a foreign state. But Jean-Pierre Disseral, your view of how to walk this line, the line between what is the right of anybody to evade taxes and what states like the US would insist is absolute criminal activity that is tax fraud, and will continue that fight in countries that are not theirs.
Yes, but I understand very well the U.S. position, and I would add something to it, is that when at the beginning of the year of the 2000s, Swiss banks or other banks signed the qualified intermediary agreement with the IRS, that was very clear that any bank that had signed that agreement should not fool around with the IRS and had to comply with it. And I must make one comment, certainly. Some Swiss banks did not comply with the QI agreement, and that got them into trouble. And that was a private agreement between them and the IRS, where the government had no impact. Now, that is one thing, and these banks have done. Once they had that agreement, they shouldn't have encouraged U.S. citizens, and I'm talking about encouraging, not just welcoming, but encouraging U.S. citizens to avoid paying taxes. And that is really what I consider the beginning of the problem between the IRS and the Swiss banks.
Well, there has been plenty of reaction on Facebook. Abiodun Alowatayo says, "This is betraying the trust of their customers." Kennedy Chilaka says, "This is unethical and should be discouraged. Customers should sue the banks for failing to keep their secret." Nurul Karim says, "Switzerland should be renamed Thieves' Den. That's what it is in reality." And Swati Manchakanti adds, "Tax evasion is a crime no matter what country you are in. What else is the US supposed to do to catch white-collar criminals?" Well, Kevin Hassett, your view about that. There has been criticism of the US for its position in this, but what else can it do to combat what are, in its view, completely illegal acts?
Right. Well, I think that my own preference would be that the U.S., to the extent that it suspects that there's law breaking going on, real fraud going on, find ways to track down its citizens. And they're very aggressive doing that, and I think appropriately so when people are committing fraud, because those folks are increasing the taxes on law-abiding citizens if they're allowed to get away with it. And I think that again, the question is it possible for the U.S. to track down the lawbreakers without any help at all from the banks in the country where the lawbreakers are locating their money. And it seems like the reason why the U.S. went after these Swiss rules is that there was a wall that they couldn't get past, and the U.S. Criminals were effectively using the Swiss banks effectively to avoid U.S. law, and that the U.S. couldn't really get enough evidence to nail the criminals without the help of the banks. And I think that's why that they were as aggressive as they were. And to be sure, I think that a lot of bad guys have been caught by this. But I am also, as you are, troubled by the extent to which one country can think that its own laws extend to people that don't even live or visit or have an operation in that country, but just interact with the citizens of that country abroad.
Well, Jean-Pierre Disserat, I mean, is the U.S. taking a crowbar to a situation here? We've acknowledged that there have been possibly criminal activities by banks in the past. Certainly there has been criminal activities by individuals. But this legislation would appear to allow the U.S. to conduct what amount to fishing expeditions, to investigate on the basis of suspicion, something that within the U.S.'s only legal code it cannot do. Is this double standards being practiced in another country?
Yes, I think that there is definitely, or the U.S. is taking Switzerland up because it is its major competitor in that particular industry. But what I'd like to say is, there's estimates about what the total amount of tax evaded money is out there and belongs to U.S. citizens. And the latest figures I heard is there's about $40 trillion out there that are U.S. tax money, and that is not reported to the IRS. And there's only a very, very small amount of this that is deposited with Swiss banks. Swiss banks have never been the major place where the U.S. citizens come and hide their tax avoided money. It's other places. So my question is, why does the U.S. concentrate so much on Switzerland that is holding maybe 2 or 3% of the total evaded money, if its only reason is not to get the business back that Switzerland has been practicing for the last couple hundred years with a lot of success, to protect the assets of people who honestly earned their money?
Well, let's put that question to Kevin Hassett, if I may. We heard there the figure $40 trillion being withheld from the IRS. But that particular question, why is the U.S. focusing on Swiss banks in particular when it would appear that much of these hidden funds are elsewhere?
Well, that's something I don't have data on, so I can stipulate that it's true, but I don't know that it's true. But the one thing I do know is that this is a U.S. enforcement action that's been done by U.S. enforcement professionals, and that they went after the companies that they went after, both because they thought they had identified clear misconduct, and because they thought that they could make the case and win in court, which they did. And I don't think that there's anything at all to the accusation that they decided to choose to go after this company or that company because they're competing with U.S. firms. That's not the way the enforcement folks work. They found a place where there's something that they can go after, and they went after it successfully. And so maybe they'll go after other countries as well in the future. But in this case, you'd have to say that from their enforcement perspective, they chose well. They found an action that ended up giving them a satisfying result.
Well, Jean-Pierre Disserat, very briefly, a final point to you. There are innocent people involved in this. You've got, for example, Swiss bank employees who could face legal action because of a change in the law, where before they thought that they were obeying a law, now they could be open to prosecution.
Yes, that is true, but this is the general trend we observe, unfortunately, that the rule of law does not apply anymore today. and that retroactivity of the law is commonly used and applied by politicians or for political reasons. And of course, this is something we as an NGO with the United Nations will certainly continue to watch very carefully, especially at the human rights level, because unfortunately, there are some bully states or bully unions in this world that have taken the bad habit to enforce things that are absolutely unenforceable or should not be, and they have the bad habit to force on other jurisdictions or on other sovereign states rules and obligations that they do not even respect themselves.
Well, the argument is going to continue,
something...
but thank you to my guests, Jean-Pierre Disserand and Kevin Hassett. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.